Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast coming your way, episode 188. We're speeding right along. Stevesmi, the Mobster, joining me. What's going on?
That's good. We've got some ins and outs, some good, some bad, some politics, some business. Interesting guy and a hyper responder as a bodybuilder. Let's get into it.
So Mobster's boy, Vince Taylor, is who we're going to talk about today. And Vince Taylor is one of the most, I would say, he's got a lot of wins under his belt. In fact, he set the record for the most IFBB titles at 22. That would be later snapped by Ronnie Coleman, who got 26. He holds the record for most Masters Olympia wins. He dominated the late 90s. He was winning every year in the Masters. Most experts, including us, think he's the most prolific bodybuilder of all time. That's how I would describe him. So we're going to go over all. We're going to go over all of that. Stats, 5'9", a shredded 230 for competition, and 250 pounds in the off season. And those of you who maybe not heard the name, you might know about the posing routine. He's well known for the Terminator posing routine. So Mobster, explain what that was, the Terminator posing routine.
Right. So any good poser, I've used the phrase before, Steve, when we talk about the zeitgeist or something. And what I mean by that sometimes is something of the moment, right? Whether it's an actor, a politician, a singer, or whatever else, where they're able to tune into a moment. So what happens, you need to be a great poser. And we're going to get into why he was a great poser later on. But he came up with this routine because the Terminator movie had just come out. And it was, of course, crazy popular. Arnold Schwarzenegger, bodybuilder, is the Terminator. He's going to come in from the future. He's going to kick your ass. There's no way to escape him, etc., etc. People are going crazy. They're queuing up. They're doing the midnight showings, all that kind of stuff. And whether it's a great tune or, in this case, this movie vibe, he comes up with this routine. I don't even know if he was the first, Steve. He was definitely the man that made it and took it and owned it. So he comes out on stage and there's a little bit of music, and I think the original version, Steve, there's a little bit of funky music or whatever, and then it kind of goes into this Terminator voice, and he's just like locking his guns into position like he's got a laser sight going on, and the crowd's like goes quiet for a moment, and then he's like marching like a Terminator robot across the stage, and people are like, what the fuck? And then they just start going crazy, and he owns that shit. He owned that stage. Whether he won that competition or not, he owned that stage for 5, 10, I think it was like an 8-minute routine, Steve. I'm going to say 8 minutes he owned it. That no one else was going to touch him. If there's a posing award, he's going to win it. It looks like there's that kind of fucking moment where he's almost like going to win this posing award forever. There are still people doing Terminator routines now, Steve. And you're talking at least 20 years ago. Guys, look it up. Put Vince Taylor Terminator routine. The founder, the man that owned it right from the beginning, and put it in there. And imagine you're back in like 1980 something or whatever when the movie came out, and this amazing physique, this great black bodybuilder comes out and he owns that stage for 8 minutes with this whole robot thing. I mean, there's been loads of good posers, great music, etc., etc. But this was iconic. It was one on its own. And it's well worth watching just to get that vibe. To say that as of its time was on point. The guys, if you look at the Mr. Olympia now, Steve, most of the top pros, they're kind of just going like through maybe the 6 basics and 2 or 3 other exercise poses, and maybe one that they own for themselves. None of them are really putting in effort. Vince put in their effort, and it showed. Definitely worth checking out. Back to you.
Yeah, and you can look up the videos of it. It's going to be linked in the article, of course. So, getting his career going in a weird fashion. Really, really interesting story. I found fascinating. He was early life, though. First, 1956 is when he was born. Very gifted. Played many sports. He dominated his older peers throughout childhood. his favorite sport, football. Now, he weight trained to get better at football, but in the process, he fell in love with bodybuilding. So his first actual competition called Mr. Berlin, this was in 1983. He actually got into 2 car accidents in a row on his way to the competition. First was behind the theater in a car lot, and the second was 100 feet away at an intersection where he hit a guy in front of him. So after he had to wait for the police to figure everything out, make the report and everything, he was late to the competition. But it ended up being a blessing because he had to compete in the higher heavyweight category. So he ended up winning first place. So ended up turning out to be really a good thing. And I guess fate sent him in that direction. He took a few years off to improve his physique. And in 1987, he got 4th place at the NPC Nationals. The next year, he came back and won first place at that same competition. And that's where he got his pro card. So really, really patient to take a few years off and then come back. We don't see patience in today's society like that.
I'm going to jump in here, Steve. There's a couple of backstories for you guys in terms of which Vince talks about in interviews. So as Steve just said, that was the Mr. Berlin competition. And I don't believe that Vince was actually in the military, but he went out originally to Germany, obviously a contractor of some description. I don't know what his day job was, but he was out there working on the army bases. And essentially in one of these interviews we does with John Hanson, he said, I loved it. The life of a single man in another country on the army bases. The guys are like, you know, all receptive to a fella coming all the way from the States to come and work on the army bases. They're grateful for you being there. He loved it. He said it was just amazing. In terms of the competition, I want to get into something very, very quickly here. He's what I've termed in my show notes is called a John Brown pupil. Now, guys, if you don't know who John Brown is, so put John Brown bodybuilder, Sean Ray Vince Taylor into Google, see what comes up. An amazing poser, which ties in with the Terminator rune that we've already talked about. And specifically, and this is something that he talks about in an interview again with John, he said, so what happened was he goes to, I think he went back to the States and then decided to go back to Germany to work out there full time, to get into the whole lifestyle that he'd seen over there. So he goes back. He goes with the guys, with his buddies, whatever, to a bodybuilding competition for some particular reason. And on stage, owning that stage, like I've just talked about with Vince with the routine, is John Brown. He's killing it. And to quote Vince, he says, there's John, looking amazing with his jerry curls, very much of the time, like an afro with sort of a lot of hair gel on, but owning this stage and entertaining the crowd. And they said what really caught his eye was John comes off stage. The competition's over, and there are a lot of, in Vince's words, he's hanging around John. They've seen this guy, they've seen him move, they've seen him shake it. They're all like touching his arms and wanting to talk to him or whatever else. He says, right then and there, I decided I was going to be a professional bodybuilder because I wanted what John had. So there's a particular thing. And I also think it's not just him. Possibly we've done podcasts on Dennis James, someone who's enjoyed traveling around the world and seeing other countries, seeing other lifestyles and whatever. So, I mean, I'm going to get into it more later on, Steve. Definitely elements of, as a professional bodybuilder, he seemed to feel more welcome and appreciated as an athlete in Europe than he did in the States. But again, we're going to get into that later on as to the whys and wherefores. Back to you.
Let's kind of get into how it went. He got 3rd place behind the 2 Lees, Lee Labrada and Lee Haney, 1988 Mr. Olympia. That was incredible to get 3rd place. That just shows you what kind of bodybuilder he is. Yeah, that same year he won the Night of Champions, finished 2nd at the Grand Prix England and Grand Prix Finland. In 91, Mr. Olympia, he again got 3rd place, this time behind Haney and Yates. And his other Mr. Olympia finishes, 92, he got 6th place, 95, 5th place, and 11th in 2006. Now, Masters Mr. Olympia, he dominated 96, 97, 99, 2000, and 2001. He won. The only reason he didn't win it in 98, and I actually looked into this, is there was no Masters Mr. Olympia in 1988. And I don't know, Monster, do you know why there was none that year?
No, I think possibly I'm trying to so don't quote me on this, guys. I think it was literally there was some argument with the promoter. I believe I think it was a woman, again, don't quote me on this, put together a competition, and for some reason or other, they couldn't get the money that was required, the deposits that required, etc., etc. And it was all very much last minute, and no one else was able to step up to the plate. So it's one of those things where it appeared it was going to go ahead. It was promised it was going to go ahead and then couldn't because someone fucked up, essentially. So, yeah, again, don't quote me on this, guys. I'm literally on the spur of the moment relying on my very archaic, ancient memory of the time. And I think I read something about it in Muscle Mag International. So there's probably someone out there that would be 100% on this. So I think that's my best guess / memory of the time, Steve.
Well, that sums it up for him. He dominated ever since he was a kid against his peers and as a senior against other peers his age too. So we're talking about a guy who's genetically gifted, for bodybuilding, where he could dominate no matter if he was young, 8 years old, or if he was older. So he briefly retired from bodybuilding in 2002. A few years later, came back at 50 years old, and he got third place at the 2007 Australian Pro and third at the Arnold Classic. So even 50 years old, he was still kicking ass. 22 titles altogether, 22.
Yeah.
And he finished second or third in countless others. So we'll leave a list of the competitions.
Huge.
In the article. You guys can check out the article at a later date. But really, he was dominant, and he competed in so many competitions. I'm looking in 1991, he competed in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 competitions that same year.
1 year.
Yeah, that's one competition a month almost. I mean, that's incredible. The guy loved competing, and he was either winning these competitions or he was getting second or third place. His worst showing that year was 5th place. And then after that, his worst showing was 3rd place. So, I mean, the guy was just dominant, and he loved bodybuilding and loved competing. So that's a guy who loves doing it and who is completely happy traveling and doing all these competitions, because it takes a lot out of you to travel and do all that.
I'm going to jump in here there, Steve. So I touched on a little bit earlier on the difference between his reception in the US versus reception elsewhere. Now, here's the thing, guys. There's no doubt whatsoever that Vince is a great, great bodybuilder, but this is a hardcore body podcast because we tell you the real deal. So I've seen, just refreshing my mind this morning, watched an interview with him and refers to John Hanson already, and he talks about how he and other interviews, which I did at the same time, watching the video, reading at the same time as usual, half listening, half reading. And he talks about on bodybuilding.com not getting what he thought he was due, and I'll use that word carefully, out of the sport in the US. So he goes to, let's say, Germany again, or any of the other countries that he competed in or did tours in, and he would be treated like a star. He's feted on stage. The audience loved the routine. He's a great poser. He's a great bodybuilder. So he's going to be well received anyway. The promoters giving him the cash. He's treated well. Today was a really good night, mate. Let me take you out for a meal as an extra thank you. You know, the honeys, as he would put it, early years are hanging around. There's all that kind of vibe going on. When he came back to the States, he was placing, as Steve said, incredibly well. If he's not first, he's second, he's third. And he's doing 10 competitions in a year. The thing, my vibe and my opinion especially, was that he thought winning equated to success in the US. And unfortunately, and especially as we know in modern times, that's not the case. You don't get given a Rolls Royce and a bucket full of cash because you won. Promoters will pay you to do guest posing, but you got to work. It's quite simple. Steve and I discussed this in the pre-show. We've done this on previous podcasts. It is a business. Now, because you've traveled to Bulgaria and the Bulgarians think you're great, and the promoter took you out for a steak dinner afterwards, thank you, and he gave you $2,000 or whatever he was getting paid in those days, you come back on the plane, and he says that there was times when he's landed in countries and there's been people waiting from the airport, and he's done newspaper interviews and TV stuff, But that's because he's a great American bodybuilder going to Bulgaria or to Poland or to Hungary or whatever. When he comes back to the US, he's just a great bodybuilder. And there are other great bodybuilders, including Lee Haney, Rich Gaspari, Lee Labrada, and others. And the reality of that situation is, as a good example, Lee Haney invested in property. Lee Labrada set up a protein company, a sports supplement company. There are other things going on. What you've got to do, guys, is you have to take that fame, that great win on a bodybuilding stage, and turn it into a success. It's not given to you. You have to approach companies for interviews as many times as they'll approach you. Can't turn stuff down when opportunities present themselves. You can't say no and then expect to be successful. You've got to learn to be creative. And of course, in this day and age with social media, even more so. So the reality of the situation is, I think, is that he was expecting to be kind of fated and famous when he was in the US. And unfortunately, that was wrong. But it was wrong because he was one of a number of very, very good bodybuilders at that time. Kevin Levrone, as others, come around the same as Steve's already mentioned in one of the competition, Dorian Yates. If your local newspaper's not taking it up, why is that? If there's national stuff taking it up, why is that? Have you put out a DVD? Have you put out promotional courses about your training? Are you contacting magazines? Do you have someone in management that can help you with this kind of stuff? You're going to have to pay that person a percentage to work on your behalf as your agent, and so on and so forth. There are pro bodybuilders now that are not even first, second, or third at the Mr. Olympia that do incredibly well because, to coin a phrase, they have their business head on because their girlfriend, their partner, their training buddy is sorting stuff out for them. So they, as a good example again, Steve, if you're not sponsored by a supplement company, start one, make your own. There are companies that will make products for you. Never mind you having your own in an actual factory and a big warehouse. There are companies that will drop stuff for you. In this day and age, we don't really do the little training guides because we can go online and watch it. But again, we've talked about this in podcasts. In this day and age, you would pay the videographer the money that you make on YouTube, and then you get the money from the products that are sold, a la Larry Wills with his PR equipment and so on. So, like I said, there was a feeling or a sense for me with Vince that he didn't quite get the reason why he wasn't as big or as financially successful as he should have been, in his opinion, in the US. And it's quite simple. He needed to work for it. And I'll use this example with Steve in the pre-show. Back in the day when Joe Weider was the daddy, so to speak, and the sport, very, very lucky, got $1,000 a month when Arnold came to the States under Joe, $1,000. And Arnold quite simple straight away thought there wasn't enough money. But he didn't go back to Joe with his hand out saying, I think I deserve more money. Him and Franco started up a building company. And there's the famous story about some of the walls that they made and some of the decorating they've done still today in parts of this. He started asking Joe for a page in a magazine. This is before other guys were doing it. So because he realized that the page in a magazine was worth way more than $1,000, he got people to work on his behalf, girls, I think some of the biographies, posting out their training courses. These are actually very expensive on eBay now, Steve, so stuff like that. I mean, that was Arnold, the legendary story of Arnold taking the envelopes when they came in the post and holding them up to the light to see if they had money inside and opening those first, so that they could get the courses produced, so they could post these out, sending out Arnold t-shirts and so on. So lo and behold, you go from $1,000 a month to doubling up because you're working, and then you're getting another $1,000 a month because you've got your promotional side going on. And this is way, way, way before Vince was around and way, way before social media. Now, money will not be given to you. You have to work for it. I don't care how damn famous you are. If they got you going and opening up a nightclub or whatever, you've got to be there on time. You've got to be professional. You've got to dress well. And you've got to make the crowd feel like they're having some kind of experience. They're not going to go crazy. They're not going to give you loads of money. It's not going to be delivering sports cars for you to keep as long as you want, sir. If you're just standing there with your hand out, expecting to be famous, expecting that money to come. What do you think, Steve? Guys, I need to work for it, yes or no?
Well, it's funny because I saw something about this I was watching like a business show, and they're talking about marketing and how marketing, marketing is one of those things where, you can be let's say in bodybuilding, you could be an average bodybuilder or a guy who's done like 2 competitions. But if you have a great marketing team, you're going to have 1 million followers on Instagram, and you're going to have a bunch of endorsements from companies. But you can be a great bodybuilder and have a poor marketing team or refuse to have marketing and not. So in this example that I was reading about, Mike Trout, who's a famous baseball player, perhaps one of the top 3, top 5 baseball players right now in major leagues. And he doesn't market it. He spends his free time doing charitable work. He spends his free time visiting children's hospitals and stuff like that. He doesn't spend this free time going on TV and doing a lot of interviews and going on, these podcasts, and, doing that type of thing. And that's his thing. And that, in the end, he's missing out on millions of dollars, but that's his choice. And some in the media, criticize him for not being, marketing himself, but in the end, he's happy. He makes a lot of money just from baseball. He doesn't feel the need to go and be out there and be in the limelight. And some people aren't comfortable doing that. So in the end, it just depends. But in Taylor's case, if he was upset about his situation, I kind of don't blame him. I mean, look at what he's accomplished. But in the end, not the accomplishments don't mean shit. A lot of people are listening to this podcast and never even heard of Vince Taylor, and they're shocked. This guy has 22 titles, the most titles ever, and I've never heard of him. And that's to Vince, that might be frustrating because you're a bodybuilder and you're on stage and stuff. So, and there's a lot of money that he missed out on because of the lack of promotion. So, but, on his, there is a lot of videos floating on YouTube. He was in a documentary called Getting Pumped. He was in some one called Beyond the Masters and Vince Taylor Workout, which is also very popular. So those in the know in bodybuilding know who Vince Taylor is, but many do not. So it's not like his Instagram page has, tons of followers. He doesn't have that many followers. In fact, I'll tell you how many followers he has. Let me pull up his Instagram page right now while we're on the air, and I'll tell you. I bet it's not very much, Mobster. Yeah, it's only 58,000 followers for a guy who's won 50. Yeah, for a guy who's won 22 titles and countless others, second and third place, to have only 58,000 is nothing. And Ronnie Coleman, who broke his record, I can pull up Ronnie Coleman's Instagram and tell you how many he has. He has 5 million followers.
I was gonna say.
So he has 10. He has 100 times.
100 times, yeah.
100 times more followers. So yeah, it's frustrating if you're Vince Taylor. Yeah, it's frustrating, but that's one of those things where a marketing team pays off for you, and that's how it goes. So.
Let me give you an example here, Steve. I've actually told this story before. So I said back in the days when I was regularly competing in grip competition, I trained with, I'll name drop because I've done it a bunch of times before, I trained with Lawrence Charley. Now, that wasn't me and him training together. We were all together in the same gym, which myself and my business partner run at the warehouse where we had the supplement company. And I specifically know this story. Now, you remember with guys as popular as Uncle Loz, as he's described is now, especially since he's retired, we're talking about right back at the beginning of his career. So this is the very beginning of his career. And I think probably the middle of the time that I was competing. But I would argue that at that time, I had my business head on and he didn't. And I'll tell you this, right? So we've got that's competing well enough to be invited to the world's strongest man. Now, as strong as what I am in what I did back then when I was competing regularly, and that's right in the middle of my sort of lifting career, if you want to describe it as that, it's not the world's strongest man. And the world's strongest man at those times, because I spoke to people in the know, had a total viewing, and this is all the re-shows, it's all the sports bar stuff, and it's all the mainline TV in the US and in the UK and in Europe. And I think the audience was somewhere around total viewing figures were around 200 million, Steve, which is not unreasonable. And again, I mean, I think, for example, the money for winning the world's strongest man at that time was less than the money for the Mr. Olympia. And even then, the money for the Mr. Olympia is not as good as it is now. So you got that, right? But you could make money doing some of the tours and the pro competitions and the qualifiers and so on and so forth. The year that Lawrence went pro, the girlfriend that he was with at the time stayed in her job to support him so that he could take this pro career. And I made more money doing exhibitions and putting on seminars and winning cash and getting given free shit because I was making a name for myself, because I was self-promoting through I had self-promoted through Muscle Mob, my magazine, because I had allowed myself to be interviewed for other magazines, because the internet, as was then, and we're talking around, I'm going to say year 2000, had already taken off. So I was out there, I was pushing myself as a grip athlete on bodybuilding, like on Evo and Elite and Anabolics, etc. I was pushing myself on those sites, so they knew that I was the grip guy, myself and a couple of others, David Horn especially. And so you're in that position when you become someone in the know, or who could be argued, as I am on even still now in a couple of UK forums, a guru. And what that meant was that I got given free stuff. I got given free books, I got free grippers, and so on. That and the money that I got paid for doing exhibitions, so we go to say Body Power or other exhibitions here in the UK. I think the most I did was free in 3 weeks, picked up the equivalent of £1,000 for doing those free things. Lawrence wasn't getting any of those things. And an example of someone who was, Glenn Ross, who's the daddy, is a classic line that he used to use. There's a documentary or series of documentaries, two, I think they did 2 of them, called Hard Bastards, and Glenn appeared on one of those as a big, very, very big, obviously, 400-pound strong man doing the doors in Ireland, where he lived. And in the interviews, showing him working, showing him training in the gym, including going to the local butchers, where Steve, he's given half a pig or half a cow. There's hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat going into the boot of his car. And in the window of the butchers is a picture saying Glenn Ross eats the meat from this shop or something like that. So, and I said, Lawrence wasn't getting so much as a fucking sausages. He hadn't put himself forward. He wasn't thinking like a pro. So he wasn't doing personal training. He wasn't doing any one-to-one stuff. He wasn't doing any training by internet or by email or by telephone. He wasn't doing any of those things. He didn't have clothing with his name on it. He wasn't working with a supplement company. There's an example right now, how much has changed since then. He works with a clothing company that makes clothing for very big guys like himself. He gets paid to do commentary at the shows, which he wasn't getting before, and so on. More so since he retired, and especially since he's been married to Liz, Auntie Liz, as she's called, and they've got a YouTube channel and so on. So his attitude changed as he learned and became a professional. I suspect, and as I said this already, and this doesn't just apply to Vince, you need to maximize your, especially as an athlete, and I'll reference the athlete that Steve talked about. There is an opportunity sometimes to earn a great deal of money for playing your sport. But at that level, you will not be a top gun athlete forever. You're going to get injured, body parts are going to wear out and so on. So you might end up physically knackered, worn out with injuries, etc. at age 40. You might have started as an athlete, pro athlete at age 20, and by age 40, you're done. That's the whole of your career. And we got this in this country with soccer players. A handful of those soccer players go on to become team coaches, team managers, or TV pundits. But that's like maybe 10%. The other 90% need to find something else to do. And if they didn't maximize their income during their earning years, they've got no money to fall back on. And that's why we've seen, especially 20, 30 years ago, athletes that ended up claiming money from the government because they didn't save for a pension. They didn't think professionally. They didn't work out how they could make money after their careers was over. And there's an element here, and I said it doesn't just apply to Vince. Robbie Robinson is an example I used earlier on, was told to come to California, turned up when there was no had no money, had to work out how he actually went off and did some posing that actually got him $3,000, $4,000. You can read that in his biography. And he talked about how that sorted him out for a few months until he was able to settle down and get promotional stuff done on a regular basis in California. But when he turned up, he was waiting for stuff to happen and nothing happened. When, you know, he was lucky to go and see Joe for a chat, lucky to get a few bucks off of Joe, etc., etc. And Arnold was the kind of guy that realized straight away you need to work and figure out how these things are done and maximize who's going to look after you more than anybody else, you. So as Steve said, whether that's with a marketing team, whether it's with a manager, whether it's an agent, someone to get you in the movies, someone to get you posing exhibitions, someone to argue your corner when it comes to prices, companies that are going to push products with your name on, your deal contracts, for example, if you win the Mystery Olympia, does they double up on the contract? That's not unusual. Get paid $200,000 and then win another $200,000 because you won that competition, and so on and so forth. A lot of the time, the athletes are so focused on their career, they don't really have the time or the energy to put into those kind of things. So, guys, it's not what I said with social media now. Steve's quite correct. There are young guys, and we've actually done podcasts on some of these already, who are better, way better with Instagram and way better with YouTube than many of the top athletes in the world, and have huge followings, literally because they appeal to the man in the street, and they sell clothing. Steve talked about $500 a month meal plans and diets and training courses, etc. And these, I've quoted, didn't I quote one of the podcasts with Steve? And I think he actually had a tax declared figure that he'd taken $700,000 in a year just doing online training and online courses and diet plans, and that was what he declared to the US tax office. So there's an example, guys. That if the amount of money that you can win in the Mystery Olympia is $400,000, there's an athlete who hasn't won the Mystery Olympia, who I think he actually did more the second year, but the first year when he did this to the level that we're talking about was $700,000. So guys, think pro, act pro. If you need to work with a marketing team, do so. If you need to have someone else, the wife, the girlfriend, your buddy, to look after the other side of things, then give them a decent cut and they'll work hard to promote you because it's in their interest as well. And you can focus on the training and your diet and the grind that's going to produce a supreme athlete. Let's get into the training and the nutrition, Steve, before we get to the juicy stuff.
Yeah, why don't you hit the training first, and then I'm going to talk about the diet, and then we're going to get into a steroid cycle.
Right, so guys, Vince is a fucking freak. And I say that in the nicest possible way, right? Because both with training and diet, which I'm going to let Steve touch on, it's kind of fucked up, Steve. It really is. The diet especially. When you look at a bodybuilder like Vince, you expect him to be, we just done a podcast on Mike Matarazzo, we thought about Mike consuming a quite ridiculous 7 pounds of steak in a day and no vegetables. And you go, oh, Vince has got to be doing 2 pounds of steak at least. And all this kind of stuff. Training, I'm just going to focus on the training here. So Vince used light weights. Let's not fuck around. When you look at his physique and you expect him to be doing, he's not going to be like the world's strongest man or nothing, but you go, oh, he's got to be doing 350, 400 pounds on the bench. No. He's got to be doing 400 pounds, maybe 500 pounds on the squats. No. You go, oh, look at those amazing biceps of his, including the fact that he come back from a bicep injury. He's got to be using this 30-pound dumbbells, guys, 50 pounds at the most, 200 pounds on this exercise, 300 pounds maybe on a squat, that kind of stuff. He used very, very light weights compared to what we see in the magazines and what we see online. Now, again, guys, no one's training flat out with 800-pound squats year round, bodybuilder, powerlifter, whatever. No one does that. You work up to periods like this, but Vince was nowhere near these big numbers. There was never a time where you would see him with 4 plates and 5 plates on squats in the magazines. You just didn't. He has his amazing small joints. His ability, if anything, which I'll get into specifically, his ability to focus on what he called the angles. And what I mean by that was with John Brown back in the day, explaining how you develop those little things, the show muscles, the make muscles pop. And I described it in another podcast, Steve, when I said Sam Fussel's story, A Diary of an Unlikely Bodybuilder, watching a pro bodybuilder backstage with 15 and 20-pound dumbbells and seeing the muscles swell up before Sam's very eyes. And it's the ability to put your mind into the muscle and to get an amazing contraction. And then, as uncomfortable as that is, stay there. So this is very much, I'll go through the actual numbers here. So he talks about training and multiple interviews 6 times a week. Now that right there is quite a bit, taking literally a day off. He said about the amount of time that he was sometimes training twice a day. And he said he would allow 90 minutes, especially if you're doing a morning workout. He says, I'm not training flat out for 90 minutes. That's the amount of time I allocated to go to the gym. Do a split routine, separating his pushing exercises from pulling, and then incorporating abs, legs, and miscellaneous work muscles. More than anything, believing in the feeling, as I said earlier, in the focus of working on his lifts and rejecting the characterization that he lifted heavy weights, 100%. It was definitely a lightweight lifter. On the flip side, he throws out a suggestion that people said he was using high reps. Again, no. If you look, and we described this in the article, an average workout split from was 30 sets and keeping a rep range of 6 to 12. Now, I've had a competing athlete train here during COVID, who should remain nameless for obvious reasons. And this particular person has also been a judge at bodybuilding competitions. And when we had other athletes come in, including a couple of guys that were talking about competing, I'd have him show them how to do a couple of exercises where he would, for example, not locking out on an iso lever leg press and putting your foot on a position in such a way on the foot pedals, the panels, whatever you want to call it, that they're pressing on, because it's two separate legs, and the tension stays on the quad the whole damn time. And I never saw anybody go over 45 kilograms on the exercise. On concentration curls, getting the angle just so and twisting your arm around into such a position that from start to finish, you felt the tension on the bicep and nothing else. And then we would have, I said, show them the tempo and the speed. Now, this is where the difference sometimes between a good amateur and a good professional bodybuilder, and good genetics and bad genetics. Now, you can have great genetics and be a shit athlete. That happens all the time. You need the desire, you need to put the effort in. But if you're the kind of fella, and Vince is definitely comes into that category, who's able to completely focus on the moment and completely focus on the movement and keep it just about as strict as it needs to be, and have the tension on the muscle the whole damn time, and then, like Vince, you're a hyper responder, you blow up, you've got 20-inch arms at 5'9", then you've got something that hardly anybody else has got. I say this as a person that's more of a strength athlete, of course, who throws weights around, not as much as he used to, but just because it wears you down at some point. And even then, so he's ended up with injuries, etc., which we talked about. So yeah, there's another thing as well, guys. There's no damn way that you're not a hyper responder and you're competing 10 times in a year. There's no damn way that you're not a hyper responder and winning and placing that high in these kind of competitions. And again, even with the posing, watching him pose, Stephen, and I'm not talking about the Terminator routine, but other things, is his awareness of himself and his physique and how it's being displayed is on point. So this is definitely, guys, if you ever go to, I mean, I'm very lucky in that we do a former professional bodybuilder that trains occasionally, certainly more frequently years ago, at my local gym that I still go to when I'm not training here at the house, and watch him train. And he's no heavyweights, he's reasonably strong, but nothing crazy heavy. But his focus, the rep range, the non-locking out, the keeping the tension where it needs to be. Vince was a master of this, and his genetics, his blessed genetics, those small joints, and his hyper response to being able to do these things enabled him to have the physique that he had and to win the competition in the gym. Let's go to the nutrition, Steve, because I think it's just as freaky, if not more so.
All right, let's talk about it. So, as Mobster alluded to, very interesting on his nutrition. So, genetics allow you to do things. They do allow you to do things that other people cannot do. This is why, we always tell you guys, don't follow what pros do, because what pros do, either you're going to follow what a professional bodybuilder does and you're going to get fat, or you're going to follow what Taylor did and still does, and you're not going to be able to achieve your fitness goal. So Example, he doesn't believe in a restrictive diet. In other words, if he wants to eat a cheeseburger, he's going to eat a cheeseburger. If he wants to eat fast food, he's going to eat fast food. If he wants to drink a Coke before his workouts, he's going to drink a Coke, which he does. Yeah. And comfort food has an effect on you mentally. So in his case, drinking a Coke before his workouts, that's a comfort food. That's a comfort drink. He enjoys a Coke and he drinks it, you know, and that gives him whatever he needs to get in his workout from a mental standpoint. Now, I would make the argument if he had his diet on point from the very beginning, maybe he would have gotten first place at Mr. Olympia. Maybe he would have followed, he would have done what Ronnie Coleman did after him, you know? So it's hard to really know. Another thing he did that not others have done among the professionals is he never found it necessary to eat many meals per day. So he had to follow the very 70s style old school diet. This is how the guys really, they ate during the 70s, 2 to 3 meals a day, whole foods, a simple chicken, rice, broccoli, you know, something like that. That's what they would eat. And they would, you know, they would show pictures of them, how they ate back then. That was how they ate. And that was considered weird in those days. And now we look at it and it's like, wow, you know, I think it's simple. And in his case, a typical meal would be meat and eggs. Very, very simple. It's not really complicated. He said, overall, I'm not a big consumer, never have been, never will be. So even to this day, he doesn't eat very much. And, you know, this proves that you don't have to eat tons of protein every day to build muscle. You just don't. But then again, he also has the genetics. So, yeah, Mobster, give your thoughts on that. We'll get into the steroid side.
I'm going to say, right, so for example, Steve, if you and I have a cola before a workout, I know that I would be gassy as fuck with I very rarely drink cola anyway, any kind of cola. I don't care where it's from, whether it's the real deal or some generic version. Very rarely. And if I like caffeine because I like my coffee before I hit the gym. I'm not a fan of pre-workouts, for example, and I've mentioned this many times, but the idea of having a caffeinated and sugary drink, that's not too bad, but carbonated as well. So I would be burping and farting and it would feel really gassy and uncomfortable to get that in and then go work out. I think the sugar thing would fall off very quickly, even if the caffeine stayed. So that's what's up right there. And I know from the article and from looking up stuff online, he talked time, Steve, having 1 meal a day. Now, Steve is a great one for fasting. And there's even an argument that you could say, well, Vince was kind of doing that. But I don't think Vince was. I think Vince just didn't plan. If he wasn't hungry, he didn't eat. If he didn't feel like he felt like he was full up already, he stayed until he didn't feel full up. So there's an element of that. But the reality of the situation is here, guys, and Steve's quite correct. You don't need to have pounds and pounds of meat. You don't have to have 1,000 grams of carbs a day. You've got to be that kind of response just for that volume of food and the ability to digest it. So that in itself, you need to be a kind of freak if you're doing, 3 pounds of steak and 1,000 grams of carbs. You need to be, you need to be using growth. You need to be using insulin. You need to be using a bunch of peptides, and you need to be 250 pounds, 300 pounds. You just do, right? Whereas the reality of the situation here is that Vince had some of those elements and didn't. And again, that's because he was a freak. So Steve's quite correct. And I'll touch on this particular line when it comes to both training and when nutrition. Vince's ability to accommodate and grow and be a great and very, very good bodybuilder and winning a number of competitions, we can't learn from Vince. We can maybe learn that bodybuilders need to be better posers and put some time in. But most of you won't learn from using very, very light weights. You need to use medium/heavy. Maybe you could learn for his level of volume, maybe 6 to 12 reps. That's kind of the sort of stuff that I do. The lower end is more power, on the upper end, that's, sometimes I'll go 20, but for the most part, it's no higher than 12 reps. But then again, I'm not a bodybuilder. When you look at food, I'm 3 meals plus protein shake. Sometimes 4 meals, but very, very rarely. And I don't think we get into the calories here, Steve, but I'm guessing it's not a lot of calories. We're not talking about great big sumo wrestlers bowl of soup here. So we're not talking about 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. So there's swings and roundabouts here, guys. One of the things you could learn from is his ability and the way that he describes it of working the angles, but more than that, getting the mind into the muscle and taking an exercise and absolutely strict as you like. Doesn't have to be immense weights. So, for example, a 500-pound benchers tend to have a big chest, but they don't necessarily have great pecs, and they don't necessarily exhibit a great side chest in a chest pose up on stage. So the ability to focus on the pecs and have them develop to their maximal amount and look great with the tie-ins, with your delts, with the rest of the abdomen, and so on and so forth. The back being flexed as you're going into certain poses by pushing them with the triceps and learning how to show the chest to its best. That doesn't come from a 500-pound bench. So Vince can teach you how to get the most out of an exercise. So go check his videos out, watch how he trains, and imagine just for a second that as he does it, he's getting a nasty, nasty burn and getting an immense pump, and just is able to put his head into that space between the elbow and the shoulder and say, grow, bitch, grow, and really work the contraction. We've talked about, I believe I've seen this done in articles, where you're trying to imagine the fibers contracted underneath the skin. And Arnold, I think, visualized, he said he was trying to imagine his biceps as mountains, and cartoonists have drawn little pictures with Arnold's imagination, and there's a sort of snowy peak inside this upper arm. So the situation right there as you go up, his desire to be the champion was probably greater than anybody else's. So therefore, trained to beat everybody else in the gym when he was at Gold's, when all the guys were there, like in Pumping Iron, all that kind of stuff. The ability to get your head into that place and be the best you possibly can, that you can away from Vince, 100%. The 1 meal, 2 meals, Coca-Cola before training, not so much. The 30-pound dumbbells, for most of you, you won't have the ability to focus as well as what you did. So therefore, a 30-pound is not going to give you a great biceps peak. And of course, the genetics for muscle insertions and so on, Steve. Now let's get into the juice. Let's get into the juicy stuff that we guys like to hear. What he talks about, what we think.
Yeah, and Mobster, do you want to touch on first what he talks about? Because there is a video that I'm going to be linking in the article, and he talks about TRT a little bit. And Mobster, maybe you can give your, I'll give my opinion on what he said. My opinion on what he said is really simple, and I'll let you chime in on that because I know you have a lot to talk about with that. But he says that he used a small amount of testosterone. He didn't like it and considered even 600 milligrams a week an excess dose. So, you know, some people don't react well to testosterone. Again, we go back to, I feel like, again, it's like quote unquote old school, but I hate that term old school. So it seems like he's more of a 70s bodybuilder when it comes to his nutrition, when it comes to his little bit of his training and with his steroid use. Because in the 70s, they did not like testosterone either, and he didn't like it. And I believe him for sure, because some people don't like what testosterone does. It makes their muscles more watery. It makes them more round. So it doesn't give you that tight look. And so I kind of get where he's coming from, and he talks about it. And, you know, he's just, I just have to keep going back to the 70s, because in the 70s, they did not use testosterone in their cycles. So I have to keep going back to that. And it seems like in his situation, he kind of followed that same 70s mentality. I almost wish he was around in the 70s in his peak years, because I think he would have dominated in the 70s. Him and Arnold would have went toe to toe together in the 70s. So. It would have been interesting. He would have had to kind of overcome the racial stuff that Chris Dickerson had to overcome. And, but it would have been really interesting to see him go toe to toe with Arnold and see those guys, see the genetics kind of go. But yeah, he really liked keeping his testosterone levels low. So those of you out there who like to run lots of testosterone on your cycles, you know, maybe maybe think about this. Think about running a cycle with no testosterone. Think of running a cycle with very low testosterone at the most and see how you react to that. You might end up liking your cycle more. You might notice less side effects, because he talks about this in the video. He likes the way he feels when he keeps his testosterone levels lower than higher. He likes the lack of bloat. He likes letting the other steroids in his cycle kind of run the action. And that's kind of what I've determined too over the years. So try something different, guys. There's no reason to be stubborn. Give your thoughts on this, Mobster.
I'm kind of torn on it, right? Because I you know that I'm a low dose fan. And again, I've touched on, I've just mentioned multiple times about his genetics response. So arguably, you go, is he talking about keeping the doses low? Because of course, as a bodybuilder of that time, or even now, you don't want to bang the drum too much about high doses, because that takes away from your training, your own focus, your ability to grow muscle, and so on and so forth. And you've got fans, and you don't want your fans thinking that the only reason you look the way that you look is because you're taking a load of gear. It might be the reality that you're taking a load of gear, and sometimes that is a necessity with your competition. But equally, he had great genetics to begin with, and so on. I mean, that's the John Brown thing again, right? And again, with Vince competing, coming back and competing, I believe he talked about for the competition he came back and competed at 50, Steve, he'd only trained for 7 months. He'd actually had the previous 4 years and 5 months with no training. That 5 year gap, 4 years and 5 months was 0 visits to the gym, no bodybuilding style training whatsoever. And then 7 months to come back and do well in Australia, etc., as we mentioned earlier in the podcast. So hyper responder. And then the John Brown, tiny waist, great posing. So as Steve said, the testosterone bloat, the way that some fellas responded, and again, maybe Vince knew how he responded. He lost the small joint look. He'd fill out, he'd be watery, his waist would swell up, and so on. So there's a lot of guys, when we talk about stomachs and abdomens not being kept under control, look at Vince posing. Look at his physique. Tiny joints, small waist, and it stayed tight. I don't think we really saw any photographs or videos, Steve, when he was out of shape. It's just that the other person, when he wasn't winning, was in better shape. You're talking about competing against Lee Haney when Lee outweighs you by 20 pounds and still has a small waist. So that's that kind of vibe going on. I agree. For example, he's saying about 600 milligrams a week as an excessive dose. But again, it might be one of those things where he has to say it, or even when he took more gear, he would consider 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 to be excessive. But maybe he still needed to do that in order to kick ass, and especially later on in his career, if not at the beginning. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, Steve. I think there's also, do we talk about what specifically we think he took, or do we talk about what athletes of his generation and that were competing at the time? So I think when we discuss his cycle, we should have half an eye on whether he used more than he would like to refer to, because that took away too much from what he was doing in the gym and his genetics, and yet at the same time he was using that amount of gear, or whether we say, if it wasn't Vince, this is what anybody else who didn't have Vince's genetics would be using. And that's kind of my approach here, Steve. I'll start it off for a change. Use per day of HGH. 100% of the guys were starting to use HGH then, in fact, earlier, but it become a big thing to be used on a regular basis. And this is when the numbers started to creep up. I'm going to say, Steve, that when the beginning of his career, 5 IUs for athletes competing at the level that Vince was competing, but it was starting to creep up. And by the time Vince came along, and especially at the middle of his career, 15 IUs per day would be typical. Now, we know in modern competitions and competing and cycles, the numbers are getting higher and higher and higher. So we see much bigger numbers now. But again, there's no argument about what Vince did working for Vince. And keep that in mind, guys. So we can talk about this from a perspective of what he might have used. It doesn't mean it'll work for you. Something that Steve talks about in the article is 1,200 milligrams a week of primobolan. And again, this is a show thing. And as Steve said already, you're not looking at a watery physique ever on stage for Vince. So, and again, it's a 70s drug, but taken to a bigger number. So instead of the Arnold-esque 200 milligrams a week. We're talking about 1,200 milligrams a week. The next drug I'm a fan of, and even then, perhaps not at this level, with the other drugs, 1,000 milligrams a week of Deca. Now, Vince, with the poundage that he was using, not going to be ruining his joints. So this is for him much more of a muscle building, muscle retaining drug, a show drug, especially with the primo, than it is a curing what ails you in terms of joint wear and tear, because he shouldn't be pounding it. And of course, I say that with the fact that, as we know, he did actually tear a bicep. Funny enough, I believe it wasn't in the gym. I think it was swimming, and it took him that long a time to come back. But it was also because of the lightweights, he wasn't tearing that shit up after. So this is not a joint drug for him. This is a retaining muscle, growing muscle. And then finally, Steve, and I hand it over to you, a relatively low dose, as Steve said already, and purely and simply because maybe he knew how he responded to it. And that was 200 milligrams of week testosterone. Now that's, as Steve says, bearing in mind you can watch a video where Vince touches on it himself, a TRT dose. That is a tiny, tiny amount. In fact, there's an awful lot of fellas call themselves TRT when they're on half as much, again at 300, whereas in reality, TRT could be dosed a lot less. But for him, in conjunction with the drugs that we've already talked about, just enough to let it shine, but not so much that he got watery, not so much that he got irritable, not so much that he had any side effects or problems. I can't think of a single photograph or video from any of that time when I was around and become interested in bodybuilder, Steve, when there was an out of shape Vince Taylor. There might have been a slightly smaller Vince Taylor or slightly bigger. There might have been a slightly older one when it comes to winning the Masters, especially at age 50. But there was never an out of shape Vince Taylor. There was no watery, there was no soft looking, there was no podgy faced, round faced, belly sticking out Vince Taylor. So definitely, Steve, I agree with you. For him, maybe he realized very early on, or maybe he just modeled himself on John Brown and didn't really get used into the high levels. What about the rest of the drugs, Steve?
Yeah, the next one, MrO, 1,200 milligrams a week. No doubt, if you're running that much Deca, you got to run a DHT with it. And the Primo is a DHT, but MrO is a straight DHT. So dihydrotestosterone derivative, MrO, great for vascularity, great for hardness of the muscle, great for giving you that contest look, the cuts, the muscle cuts. So that would be something for him. Winstrol, 200 milligrams a day. I get the sense that, you know, around the time he was competing, orals were really, really important. They're quick acting in the body. They're out of your body quick. There's a lot of flexibility with using oral steroids. Winstrol is great ahead of the competition. It's going to dry you out. It's going to increase vascularity. So it's basically similar to MrO, except it dries the crap out of you much more effectively than any other steroid out there. And you'll notice that if you run Winstrol, you'll notice your joints feel very dry, even though you may never, ever have had any joint issues before. Well, even on Winstrol, you will notice that dry joint feeling. Well, that's something that Vince would have not minded because Vince lifted lighter weights. If you remember from earlier in the podcast, what Mobster talked about. So to me, it'd be perfect to use Winstrol if you're a guy like him. And then even in a situation where he would lift heavier weights, he's still got that Deca in there. He's still got that Deca to help offset those joint issues. So a lot of yin and yang here. And then Turinabol, 150 milligrams per day of Turinabol, great steroid, low side effects, hardens you up, good for vascularity. So that would be something that he would have loved as well. And then, of course, diuretics. Diuretics, you play around with diuretics ahead of your competition. It helps flush excess water out of your system. And that's something that they messed around with a lot in those days when Vince was doing well. So yeah, any final thoughts on this, Mobster, before you take us to the disclaimer?
I think on the cycle stuff here, very quickly, Turinabol has been around for a long time, guys. It's one of those drugs that we sometimes think hasn't, but it has. And it's one of those, any of these items would have been down to accessibility. But you've got to remember, he was in Europe a lot, as much as he was in America. So I could argue that accessibility wouldn't have been too much of an issue. So yeah, I think it's one of those things when it comes to the cycle, Steve, that when he says about 600 milligrams being a week an excessive dose, bodybuilders, especially those that are competing at his level, are doing what needs to be done. If you look at the sheer numbers, it's a decent, there's a couple of grams a week going in here, Steve, maybe a little tiny bit more, but you're not looking absolutely crazy amounts, but they were starting to creep up in those days. So we're second guessing, as we always do with these podcasts when it comes to the cycles, unless we specifically say that they've talked about it, and we know that he's talked about TRT. So we go, right, did he use some of these things? I'm going to say 100% yes, Steve. He would have experimented, he would have found out what worked for him and what didn't. And that's what quite often in this day and age, that doesn't happen as well. So you could try low doses, you could see how you respond. He might not have liked how he felt on certain drugs. He might not have liked whether he got watery. He might have been doing a lot of guest posing. If he's competing 10 times a year, couldn't get out of shape. And then when we talk about the Winstraw as a dryer and the Masteron as it's great for competition, 100%. When you're competing 10 times a year, you need to be hard, you need to be ripped. And especially when you go back and look at those times when he was competing at that level of that frequency and staying in shape the whole damn time, even if he wasn't winning every single competition. And there's been times when he has. You don't get that if you're watery, if you're out of shape, if you're fat, and if you don't know how you respond and respond well to certain drugs. And again, we can look at the drugs that others were using at that time. Finally, as I said on that already, and that is whether he's going to admit to using these drugs or whether he says 600 milligrams a week is an excessive dose as a way of getting you, the listener, and the followers that you would have had at that time and now not to go crazy, relying on drugs to do everything, which is a big problem, guys. You need to be putting the time in the gym. If you don't have his genetics, if you're not able to get your mind into muscle, if you can't get the angles worked, as he like to put it, then taking all these drugs is not going to turn you into a Vince Taylor. It's going to turn you into a watery mess if you're not careful. You can't do Coca-Cola as a pre-workout. You can't eat one meal a day, and then you can't do all this level of drugs and not have his genetics and hope for the same response, because it's just not going to happen. So you've got to remember, guys, learn from how he was able to put his mind into the muscle. The rest is going to come down to Vince's genetics. And trust me, there's only maybe 2 or 3 other bodybuilders that had the kind of genetics and the hyper response that Vince had and was able to lift the kind of lightweights that he did and still look the way that he did. And then learn how to be a great poser and show that muscle on stage. And still, as I said already, competing 10 times. I've competed 4 times in a year, Steve, and I did not like it. I preferred once. That's from my strength stuff. The idea of dieting down and getting into shape or better shape, because you're not getting out of shape, and competing 10 times a year, that's just fucked up. Most top athletes now, unless they're running behind on the points qualifier, I think you're looking at your top pros are competing 2, maybe 3 times. And if you're a big Ramy, if you've won a Mr. Olympia, you aren't competing apart from at the Mr. Olympia. You're doing the least you possibly can. I think there's also an argument here for him earning money by competing as frequently as he did, because obviously of what he said about how he was treated commercially and marketing-wise in the US versus elsewhere. So in other words, he was probably getting the money that he thought he deserved from bodybuilding, from placing, from winning, and from doing posing and exhibition work in between those competitions versus the way that we make money from social media now. So guys, apply what you can learn from him, ignore the fact that he was a genetic freak, and by all means, check him out. He is definitely worth looking up. He's definitely, 1 or 2 of you listeners may well have this kind of freaky genetics, in which case apply. And by number 1, please check out that Terminator routine. It is an absolute classic. It really is. It's one of those things that teaches you. Too many professional bodybuilders in this day and age do not put the time and the effort into their stagecraft. They don't own the stage. They don't look like they should be there sometimes. The only time it gets live is during the pose down. And sometimes it looks like they've just taken a song out of the charts and they're going to come on and do eight poses and repeat. And when the 2 minutes are up, they walk off and let the physique do the talking. By all means, if you've got a big Ramy type physique, maybe that's all you need to do. But some of you are competing And the thing that's going to help you win, especially if your competition is very, very close physically, would be a great routine. And trust me, if you like being on stage and you're up in front of 2,000 people and the lights are shining down in your eyes and you've worked hard all year to get into shape for this competition and it's real, real close, having 2,000 people go crazy because you are showing them something they've never seen before, and it's in a routine like the Terminator routine, which I believe was probably done at the first time, and I think he did it at smaller shows and then eventually took it to the Olympia. The Olympia was up there in those days with 4,000 people, and the crowd goes crazy. That is a vibe that many an entertainer tells you can't get. That's the best high they get. And if they take drugs afterwards, it's because they're trying to get the high that they got being up on stage, whether they're doing comedy or singing or a great film star, or in this case, an absolutely amazing physique competitor with an amazing, outstanding, of its time, iconic posing routine. Check it out. Right, guys, as always, please note, we are not doctors and the opinions on this podcast are ours and ours alone. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.